The rain had just started falling when Karoline Leavitt stepped out of the coffee shop near DuPont Circle. A campaign strategy meeting had ended early, and for once she had a few minutes to breathe. She took a slow sip of her black coffee and turned toward the park. That's when she saw him. Sitting alone on a bench under a dripping elm tree was an older man, maybe mid-60s, with graying hair, a trimmed beard, and a worn brown coat that looked 2 decades old. He wasn't begging. He wasn't even looking up. He just sat there staring at the pavement, hands buried in his sleeves. Karoline slowed. She wasn't one to intrude, but something about his stillness. It didn't feel right. The park was nearly empty, and the man hadn't moved in minutes. Most people walked by without a glance. Some glanced, frowned, and kept walking. She stopped, turned around, walked back toward the bench. "Excuse me," she said gently. "Are you all right, sir?" No response. His eyes remained downcast. The rain picked up slightly, tapping his shoulders, soaking his coat. She didn't leave. Instead, she walked to a nearby food cart and bought a second coffee and a plain bagel. Returning to the bench, she sat a few feet away and set the coffee beside him. Still silence. Then, almost imperceptibly, he moved. A flicker of his hand, a slight turn of his head. Slowly, he looked at her. His voice was hoarse. "Why did you do that?" Karoline offered a soft smile. "Because it looked like you needed someone too." A long pause. He stared at the coffee, then at her. "I don't need your pity," he said, more tired than angry. "It's not pity," she replied. "It's just human." He stared at her for a long moment. Then slowly he reached out and took the cup. His hands shook. Karoline noticed how pale they were. "Thanks," he mumbled, sipping. She glanced at the watch on her wrist. Her next event was still 30 minutes away. "Do you live nearby?" she asked. He gave a short laugh. "I used to." His voice cracked, and for a moment he looked like he might cry, but he didn't. "Name's Walter," he said finally. "Karoline," she replied. "Nice to meet you, Walter." They sat in silence for a few more minutes. The rain kept falling, light and steady. The city moved around them, fast and blind. Before she left, she scribbled her name and number on the back of a business card and handed it to him. "If you ever need someone to talk to, even just for coffee," she said, "reach out." Walter didn't respond. She walked away, not expecting anything to come of it. But what she didn't know, what no one watching could have known, was that this moment would ripple into something far bigger than either of them imagined. 3 days had passed. Karoline had nearly forgotten about the rainy afternoon at DuPont Circle. Her days had since filled with back-to-back meetings, press briefings, and campaign logistics. The kindness she'd shown the stranger on the bench was just another quiet decision in a sea of noise. Until her phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. She almost let it go to voicemail, but something about the timing made her answer. "Hello?" A pause. "Karoline Leavitt?" the voice asked, deeper now, more composed. "Yes, who's this?" "You met me in the rain, on the bench. I wasn't very polite." Karoline blinked, standing still in the hallway of the Capitol. "Walter?" A quiet chuckle. "Yeah, I wanted to say thank you for that day." She leaned against the wall, surprised. "You're welcome. I wasn't sure I'd hear from you." "Neither was I," he said. "But I needed to." There was another pause, longer, heavier. "I'd like to invite you to something, not political, just something important to me." Karoline raised an eyebrow. "What kind of something?" "You'll see," he replied. Against every instinct drilled into her from years in media and politics, she agreed. That Friday, Karoline arrived at a sleek, glass-walled building downtown. She checked the address twice. It wasn't a shelter, it wasn't a nonprofit. It was Greer International, as in the multi-billion-dollar logistics and infrastructure company. The receptionist greeted her by name before she could speak. "He's been expecting you." Still stunned, Karoline stepped into the elevator, heart pounding. When the doors opened to the executive floor, Walter Greer stood waiting, clean-shaven, crisp navy suit, posture strong. Karoline froze. I am, he said simply. But 3 days ago I was just a man who had nothing left to give. You didn't know my name, and you didn't care. You treated me like a human being. I just gave you coffee, she said, almost whispering. You gave me dignity, he replied. He led her into a conference room overlooking the Capitol. Documents were spread across the table: policy briefs, urban renewal plans, community grant proposals. I want to help, he said, not just with money. I want to invest in the people politicians forget, and I want you to be the reason why. Karoline sat in stunned silence. The weight of what she had triggered hit her like a wave. This wasn't just a follow-up call. This was the beginning of something far, far bigger. The city buzzed below the window, oblivious to the quiet revolution beginning 30 floors above. Karoline sat across from Walter Greer, still struggling to reconcile the man before her with the shivering figure on the park bench just days earlier. He poured her a cup of tea, simple, steady, and took a seat without saying a word. "Why me?" she finally asked. Walter stared out at the skyline for a moment before answering. "You didn't ask for anything. Not a name, not a story. You didn't post it. You didn't film it. You just sat with me. That's rare in this city." Karoline offered a soft smile. "Well, I'm not from this city." Walter laughed, deep and real this time. That explains it. But something in his eyes told her there was more. "You weren't just having a bad day, were you?" she asked gently. He took a deep breath. It wasn't just a bad day. It was the worst week of my life." He looked down at his hands. "My wife died 9 months ago. Cancer. Quick and cruel. I kept working because I didn't know how to stop. Then my board tried to push me out, said I wasn't stable. I snapped at a shareholder. Lost a deal. 2 nights before you saw me, I slept in my car out of shame. I didn't want to go back to my penthouse. Too many ghosts." Karoline was silent. Not out of shock, but respect. "I was at the edge," he admitted. "You pulled me back without even knowing it." He reached into his coat pocket and placed something on the table, her card. "It wasn't just coffee. You saw me when I needed to be seen most. Not as a CEO, not as a symbol, just as a man." Karoline looked at the card, creased, slightly smudged. He had kept it. Not just kept it, carried it. "You said you want to help," she said quietly. "What does that look like?" Walter leaned forward. "I want to back the kind of leadership that doesn't come from entitlement, but from empathy. The kind that knows what it's like to sit on a bench in the rain. I want to use everything I have to change the narrative." He paused, then added, "And I want to start with you." Karoline blinked. "What are you saying?" Walter smiled. "I want to fund your initiative, whatever it is. Policy reform, media outreach, community programs, whatever speaks to you. You gave me back my life. Let me help you use yours to change others." The offer stunned her. But it wasn't the money that moved her. It was the trust. This wasn't politics. It was personal. And it was just beginning. That night, Karoline couldn't sleep. She stared at the ceiling of her apartment, the city lights sneaking through the blinds, casting faint shadows on her walls. Walter Greer, a man who could buy entire districts, had just placed his full trust in her. Not as a politician, not as a figurehead, but as a person. It felt too big, too soon, too real. She got up, wrapped herself in a sweatshirt, and sat by the window with a notebook on her lap. It was old, leather-bound, filled with thoughts she never tweeted, speeches never delivered, and dreams she rarely admitted aloud. She flipped to a blank page and wrote 2 words. What matters? Not what polls said, not what donors wanted, what really mattered. Her mind drifted back to a different day, a memory she didn't often revisit. She was 17, standing in a cold kitchen in New Hampshire, watching her father, hands calloused from factory work, try to figure out how to pay the heating bill. He hadn't asked for help. He never did. But she remembered the look in his eyes. Not fear, not frustration, just exhaustion. That was the moment she decided she wouldn't just chase success. She'd fight for voice, for visibility, for the people like her father who didn't make headlines, who didn't complain, who just kept going. She tapped her pen against the notebook, thoughts colliding like waves. Walter's offer wasn't just funding, it was a mirror, and maybe a beginning. The next morning she met him again, this time in a quieter space, a rooftop garden above the city. Walter was already there, watering a row of herbs. "I thought you were a CEO," she teased gently. He smiled. "I'm also a terrible gardener. Want some basil?" They sat on a bench under a small trellis, the sun just rising over the Capitol dome. "I thought about your offer," she said finally, "and I want to accept, but on one condition." Walter raised an eyebrow. "This won't just be about my vision. I want it to be about people like you, like my father. I want stories, not just strategies. I want change built from human moments." He nodded, visibly moved. "You're not what I expected," he said. "Neither were you," she replied. They sat in silence, the kind that didn't need filling. Just two people, one with influence, one with insight, who happened to find each other in the most unexpected way. And together, they were about to build something that could change more than one life. They were about to rewrite the narrative. 3 weeks later, the soft buzz of excitement had become impossible to ignore. Karoline and Walter's initiative, unofficially called the Bench Project, was gaining traction. Local communities had begun reaching out. Small-town mayors wanted to know more. Journalists started calling, curious how a quiet encounter in the rain had evolved into a national movement. But with attention came resistance. One morning, Karoline entered her office at the Capitol to find a thick envelope on her desk. No return address. Inside, a stack of tabloid articles, notes scrawled in red pen, and a message clipped to the front. "Careful who you partner with. Greer has skeletons." Her breath caught. She scanned the documents. Old lawsuits, half-truths, boardroom rumors. Things long buried, now suddenly dug up. Walter. She called him instantly. "I got a package," she said. "They're trying to smear you." There was a pause on the other end. Then his calm voice. "I expected this. The system doesn't like surprises." Karoline leaned forward on her desk, her voice low. "Tell me it's not true." "Some of it is. Most of it isn't," Walter replied. "I made enemies when I stopped playing their game. I lost friends when I walked away from the board, and now they want to make sure no one listens to me again." Later that day, Karoline stood at a press podium, prepared to speak about a housing grant the initiative had funded. The crowd was restless, the reporters sharper than usual. A CNN journalist raised her hand. "Miss Leavitt, are you aware of your partner's past business controversies? Doesn't this undermine the integrity of your project?" Karoline didn't flinch. She leaned toward the mic, voice clear and unwavering. "Yes, I've read the articles. But I've also read the letters from families he's helped, the contracts he tore up when they didn't serve the people. And I've sat across from him, looked him in the eye, and seen a man willing to rebuild, starting with himself." Murmurs in the room. Someone clapped, just once, but it echoed. That evening, Karoline met Walter on the rooftop again. "I didn't sign up for a scandal," she said. "You signed up for impact," he replied. "And impact makes enemies." She looked up at the stars beginning to flicker above the city. "We'll have to be smarter, stronger." Walter nodded, his voice firmer now. "Then let's start with the truth. All of it. If they want to dig, we'll show them what we've built, and what they can't destroy." They shook hands. Two unlikely allies, two wounded warriors, and a promise between them. The system could push, but they would push back harder. It was just past midnight. Karoline sat alone at her kitchen table, fingers tracing the rim of a chipped coffee mug. The Capitol was quiet. The city had gone to sleep, but her mind was racing. She opened her drawer, pulled out a small velvet pouch, and placed it on the table. Inside, a folded piece of paper, yellowed at the edges. A letter, written 12 years ago, to her mother. A letter she never sent. "Dear Mom, I'm sorry I don't say this out loud, but I know things are hard. I see how you smile through bills you can't pay, how you skip dinner so we can eat. I hear you cry when you think I'm asleep. I see you praying alone in the dark. One day I'm going to help. I swear. I won't just escape. I'll change it. I'll speak so loud the world won't ignore people like us anymore. Love, Karoline. She remembered writing it on the back porch after hearing her mother get turned away from a health clinic. No insurance, no charity spots left, just a quiet, "I'm sorry," and a closed door. Karoline had folded the letter, tucked it away, and told no one. But now, as she read it again, tears welled in her eyes. That same feeling, that fire, that vow to change it, was what drove her still. Walter's story had touched something raw, not just empathy, memory. The next morning, she walked into their project's new office downtown, a modest space buzzing with energy. Volunteers were organizing folders, young staffers were taking calls. The walls were bare, but the air was full of hope. Walter greeted her with a fresh pot of coffee and a file. "Grant applications are flooding in," he said. "This is bigger than we imagined." Karoline nodded. "It has to be. We're not just pushing papers. We're rewriting how people believe in government." He looked at her for a beat. "You okay?" She hesitated, then reached into her bag and handed him the letter. He read it silently. When he looked up, his voice was rough. "You've been carrying this a long time." Karoline nodded. "So have you, in your own way." They didn't say anything else. They didn't have to. Because the bench project wasn't about saving others. It was about honoring the parts of themselves they had once buried, and finally, letting them breathe. The attack came at 8:03 a.m. Karoline had just arrived at the office when her assistant burst in, pale and breathless. "It's on every channel, every feed." She grabbed her phone. There it was. Politico exclusive. Walter Greer's charity is a political smokescreen. Karoline Leavitt complicit? Underneath, a grainy photo of her and Walter hugging on the rooftop garden. The image looked innocent, but the angle, the headline, the implications were deadly. Her inbox exploded. Her notifications blinked non-stop, and her press secretary called twice before she could even take a breath. Walter stormed in 5 minutes later, jaw tight, holding a printed copy of the article. "They twisted everything," he growled. "Old quotes, anonymous sources, even a woman I haven't worked with in 10 years claiming I used company funds for personal gain." Karoline scanned the article again. "They're coming for both of us. They're not just smearing the project, they're smearing who we are." By noon, cable news was lit up. CNN ran a segment titled, "Redemption or Manipulation?" The curious rise of the bench project. MSNBC brought on a former donor from Walters Corporation who said, "Greer's just trying to buy back his image." Fox split the panel, half defending Karoline, half asking, "Why now?" And then came the worst of it. A whistleblower, anonymous, claimed Walter offered political favors in exchange for media silence. The evidence was weak. The story had holes. But it didn't matter. The doubt was out there. That evening, Karoline stood in front of a group of their project's volunteers, all visibly shaken. A young girl asked, "Is it true? Are they shutting us down?" Karoline inhaled, slow and deep. "No," she said, voice cutting through the fear. "They want us to fold. They want us scared. Because we're doing something they never thought we could, changing the game without asking their permission." Another hand shot up. "But what if we lose?" Karoline looked around the room, at the faces who believed in her, in Walter, in the mission. "Then we lose fighting for something that matters. But I'm not giving up. Are you?" Heads shook, voices whispered, "No." Then louder, number, and then a chant. "We stay. We fight." Walter met her on the rooftop that night, the city glowing behind him. "They think they've cracked us," he said. "They haven't seen me when I'm cornered," Karoline replied, her eyes fierce. He smiled. Now you sound like me 10 years ago. No, she said. Now I sound like me. Fully. They stood in the quiet, the storm circling but not breaking them, because when the headlines turned, they didn't bend. They built fire from the ashes. The sun had barely risen when Karoline stood at the edge of the marble steps outside the Capitol, her breath visible in the cold morning air. A podium had been placed in front of her. Dozens of cameras pointed her way. Reporters clustered like vultures. Even Walter had warned her, "They want you flustered. They want you angry." But Karoline wasn't angry. She was ready. For the past 48 hours, she'd watched as headlines morphed truth into fiction. She saw the same news outlets that once praised her for her youth and courage now twist every word into suspicion. One article even implied she had traded influence for ideology, whatever that meant. She didn't sleep. She barely ate. But she wrote. She wrote until her fingers ached. Not a statement. Not a rebuttal. A declaration. At exactly 7:01 a.m., she stepped to the mic. Silence fell. "I know what you've heard," she began, "and I know what they want you to believe." Her voice was steady. Her gaze never wavered. "They want you to think I'm naive, that I was manipulated by a man with money, that this project was just a rebranding stunt, a polished lie for public consumption." She paused, letting the air hang. "But here's what they won't tell you." She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a copy of the letter, the same one she had once written to her mother and shared with Walter. She unfolded it slowly. "When I was 17, I wrote this after watching my mother get denied medical help because she couldn't afford it. I didn't write it for the cameras, or the polls, or the headlines. I wrote it because I couldn't breathe from how angry and helpless I felt." A murmur rippled through the crowd. "I never wanted power. I wanted impact. And when Walter Greer sat next to me in the rain that day, I didn't see a billionaire. I saw a man who was trying to use his regrets to build something real, something right." She leaned forward slightly. "And you know what scares them? Not the money, not the media. You scare them. Ordinary people standing behind something they can't control. That's why they're twisting this story, because they didn't create it." Reporters began scribbling faster. A few camera operators adjusted their focus, sensing something was shifting. Karoline continued. "We didn't ask for approval. We didn't buy ads. We didn't pander. We just showed up, sat on a bench, and listened." The air grew still. Then she delivered the line she had written at 3:23 a.m., the one she knew would either bury her or make her unforgettable. "You can keep your power lunches and your staged debates. We'll take the benches, the curbs, the rooftops, the forgotten spaces where real people live and dream. And from there we'll build something you can't headline away." For a moment, there was nothing. And then, applause. It started with a few volunteers at the edge of the steps, then reporters, then the crowd gathered behind the security lines, not thunderous, not chaotic, but real. Walter watched from the side, his eyes wet. She hadn't just saved the movement. She'd become it. 1 week after Karoline's Capitol speech, Washington was no longer the same. The words, "We'll take the benches," had become more than a phrase. They were a movement. Clips of the speech went viral, not just on X and TikTok, but across international news. Students quoted her in classrooms. Veterans repeated her lines at town halls. Even conservative and liberal pundits found themselves debating one unusual thing: sincerity. The country wasn't used to seeing a politician speak like that, without handlers, without a teleprompter, without fear. And now, something wild was happening. Benches were being painted. All across America, from Portland to Pensacola, people started marking public benches with a single white line and a phrase stenciled in chalk. This is where change begins. Retired teachers sat beside first-time voters and talked about health care. College students brought granola bars and sat with the homeless. A small town in Ohio hosted its first-ever bench forum, where residents debated local issues outside. No podium, no microphones, just conversation. Karoline and Walter had started something they couldn't even fully define, and it scared people in power. Inside a marble-paneled conference room at the Department of Urban Affairs, 3 senior officials reviewed the latest polling data. "She's gained 12 points in suburban districts since the speech," one said, eyes darting across the tablet screen. "And not just conservatives, independents, even moderate liberals." Another leaned back in his chair. "She's not playing by the old rules. That's what's dangerous. You can't pin her down." A third chimed in. "You think she's aiming for Senate?" "No," the first replied, a slow grin forming. "She's aiming for the culture." Meanwhile, Karoline sat in the back of a modest church in Pittsburgh, dressed simply, without makeup or security. Walter sat beside her, hands folded. A community group was sharing stories. One man about addiction, a young mother about struggling to afford daycare, an elderly woman who'd lived through 3 housing evictions. Karoline didn't speak. She listened, and when it was over, a teenage girl with braces approached her. "Miss Leavitt," she said shyly, "I didn't care about politics before. But you made it feel like I matter." Karoline smiled and reached into her coat pocket. She pulled out a small, handwritten card with a bench etched in ink and a quote on the back. "Power begins with presence." "Write something back to me," Karoline said softly. "What you want your world to look like. Then go build it." The girl's eyes widened. "Really? Really?" Later that night, Walter and Karoline sat on the same bench where it had all started. No cameras, no reporters, just 2 people, a vision, and a quiet question in the air. "What comes next?" Karoline turned to him. "They think this ends when the cameras go dark." Walter smirked. "That's because they've only ever lived for the spotlight." She looked up at the stars. "We started something on a bench, Walter, and now the country's sitting with us." It started with a city worker and a misunderstanding. In a quiet corner of Baltimore, the original park bench, the one where Karoline and Walter first sat, was accidentally removed during a landscaping renovation. No ceremony, no notice, just a backhoe and a shrug. When Karoline heard, she didn't get angry. She simply drove there. Alone. She stood where the bench once was, just a patch of grass now, flattened by weeks of weather and footsteps. No speeches, no news vans, just a folded piece of paper in her coat pocket. 3 days later, something unexpected happened. A woman in Nebraska posted a TikTok holding a hand-painted bench plaque. "To the bench that started it all." The caption read, "If they remove one, we'll build 10 more." Within 48 hours, the bench returns was trending. Retirees crafted benches in their backyards and placed them at libraries and food banks. Teens hauled old wooden seats to school parking lots, painted with quotes from Karoline's Capitol speech. A fire station in Chicago moved its break room outside to a bench by the sidewalk, so that community members could come and talk anytime. Meanwhile, in D.C., Karoline was approached by a group of policy leaders. "We'd like to formalize this into a program," one of them said. "Government funding, oversight, bench placement committees." She smiled politely, then shook her head. "No." The room froze. "But think of the scale we could—" "It's already scaled," she interrupted, "because it belongs to them, not to the government, not to donors. It lives in the people who built the second bench, and the third, and the 1,000th. She stood, thanked them, and walked out. Months passed. Walter quietly stepped away from public view, returning to business with a different heart. Karoline declined several Senate endorsement offers. She didn't vanish, but she shifted. More parks, more listening circles, more handwritten cards passed to strangers who didn't expect to be heard. And yet, the movement kept growing, because when something is real, it doesn't need noise. On a late summer evening, Karoline returned to the patch of grass in Baltimore. It had been turned into a garden, small, neat. Lavender bushes now stood where the bench had been. But someone, no one knew who, had left a plaque nailed into the ground. "This spot once held a bench. Now it holds a beginning. Karoline knelt down, fingers brushing the inscription. She smiled, not because it was poetic, but because it was true. You can tear down a bench, but you can't erase an idea, not when it's been planted in thousands of hearts. And in the quiet that followed, Karoline whispered something only the grass heard. We're not done. And that's the story of how a single bench became a symbol of something bigger than politics, fame, or money. Karoline didn't need a title. She didn't need a spotlight. She needed a reason. And when she found it, she lit a match that reached thousands. In a world that often tries to silence truth and simplicity, she reminded us that listening can be an act of revolution, and that compassion, when consistent, is more powerful than any campaign. So next time you walk past an empty bench, ask yourself, who's not being heard? What could begin if you just sat down? This is Surprising Stories, where truth shows up in unexpected places, where one moment can shift everything. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories that inspire, confront, and move. Until next time, stay curious, stay kind, and keep watching. Because the next story might just begin with you.